Yo, what's going on? I just wanted to make this video to talk about something, right? It's a topic that people don't really talk about. So I'm gonna use this little time to really explain something to people that they might not have thought about when it comes to history, when it comes to Black history especially, right? So this video is about the Atlantic slave trade is the same thing as the Arab slave trade. I'm going to say it again. The Atlantic slave trade is the same slave trade as the Arab slave trade. It's one and the same. They lied to us in school, in propaganda, in the media, everything, to tell you that the Arab slave trade was different than the Atlantic slave trade. The Arab slave trade was first, and the Atlantic slave trade was just a continuation of the Arab slave trade. So it was one and the same thing. Now, let's start with the Arab slave trade, right? Brief general description, right? The narrative of the Arab slave trade, they say that the Arab slave trade started in the 7th century, which is basically around the 700 AD, 600 AD. The Arab slave trade was carrying a whole bunch of European people. So the slaves in the Arab slave trade, mostly, not all, mostly were European slaves, which we would call Mamluks, which we would call Slavs or Slavics, right? 18 million Slavics, or 18 million slaves, which consisted of mostly Slavics, was transported from Africa, Northern Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Europe, and the Mediterranean Sea, all the way to the Americas. That's the narrative. The Atlantic slave trade has the similar origin stories. The Atlantic slave trade was started, the narrative is, it was started in the 1600s. Well, the 1500s to the 1600s. Started with the Spanish Empire and the Portuguese Empire and the Dutch. And it was transferred to the British and the French. And they the ones that took so-called African slaves, packed them on ships like sardines, had the slaves pissing and shitting on themselves, excuse my French. And they sailed at least 20 to 30 days from Africa to the Americas to drop off some slaves in the Americas, right? North, Central, and South. First it was they stopped in the Caribbean, which is Central America. And then they set up ports all over the East Coast and North America, all the way to the South, to the Caribbean, and transfer slaves from North to South America from Africa. That's the Atlantic slave trade narrative. Now, this is my refutation to that. My belief is, like I said, the Arab slave trade and the Atlantic slave trade was one and the same. The Atlantic slave trade was just a continuation of the Arab slave trade. The narrative of the Arab slave trade, they said, lasted for 1,300 years, and that's a key. That's going to be a key part of my refutation. Concentrate on the 1,300 years that the Arab slave trade was involved. So from 700 AD, all the way to the 19th century, and even past that, is what they claim was the time of the Arab slave trade. The Atlantic slave trade, they said, lasted what, 400 years? 400 years? Okay, cool. So keep those dates and time periods in mind, because that's going to play a crucial part in my refutation. Now, one name you must understand that is going to help you to understand history a lot better. His name is a person. His name is Anatoly Fomenko. Anatoly Fomenko. Anatoly Fomenko. Fomenko. You could Google him. You could research him. He is a very important person to consider when you're researching history, especially European and American history. Right? Anatoly Fomenko is a Russian mathematician, right? He's a Russian mathematician. He spent 30 years. He's not only a mathematician, excuse me. He's a history researcher, and he's also a chronologist. Now, a chronologist is a person that attaches or tries to accurately put together real historical stories or records and attach them to real time periods or dates. All right, so he's a chronologist, trying to get accurate history with that, match it with the accurate timeline to give you a more precise historical concept of what happened back in the days, right? Like I said, he was a mathematician at first. That was his skill as a mathematician. He studied celestial movements of planets. He studies eclipses, and certain movements that could, because remember, time, the movements of the stars is the only accurate time conception, meaning that it doesn't change over time. So when you match eclipses in history and stuff like that, it can match to certain time periods in history, and that's the only way you can accurately give a precise or close to precise time period to actual historical records. That's the one reason why people say the Bible is fake, the Quran or the Torah is just talking about mythology, because they can't tie the characters in the religious books to real historical people. The reason why you can't do that, because you're looking in the wrong time period. You believe that the stories in the Bible, the Quran, was in ancient history, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years ago, when that's not true. That's false. The stories in the Bible, the stories in the Quran, the stories in the Torah, and all these holy scriptures, not even just that, in Hinduism, all religions, took place in the medieval history. Medieval history. I'm gonna say again, all historical events, records, actual events that happened in the Torah and in the Bible and the Quran spoke about medieval history, not ancient 3,000, 4,000 years ago history. Right? What does this have to do with the Arab slave trade and Atlantic slave trade? Well, simple. The time period that you believe the Arab slave trade happened is false. I'm going to repeat that. The time period that you believe they told you the Arab slave trade happened was a false narrative. They lied to you. The people that wrote these history books, they put lies in these books. Right? They mixed truth with lies. So, my argument is this. The Arab slave trade they say the Arab slave trade started in 700 AD. I'm going to say this one time, so pay attention, right? It might go over your head. 1492 AD is really 492 AD. I'm going to say again. 1492 AD, the time period they say the conquistadors or the the European colonists first, like Columbus and Soto and all these other people, when they came in the 1500s, right? So it's really 500 AD. So 1492 is really 492 AD. 1492 AD is really 492 AD. Right? And that's for the Atlantic slave trade. The Arab slave trade, they say, started in 700 AD. Right? 700 AD is really 1600s. The 7th century is really the 1600s. because they added 1,300 years to a timeline that never existed. So the original timeline, they would say the year is 492 AD. What the historians did, like Josephus Scaliger and Petrus, I forgot his last name. These were actual historians that wrote these books and timelines. They added 1,300 years to a timeline that already existed. So they fabricated 1,000 years. So again, the Arab slave trade, they said, started in the 7th century. That was a lie. It really started in the Arab slave trade started in the 1600s. So the Arab slave trade is the same as the Atlantic slave trade. I'm going to repeat that. The Arab slave trade is the same as the Atlantic slave trade. Why is that important? Because the Arab slave trade mostly consisted of white, Slavic, Eastern Europeans that was transported on ships to the Americas. And the Atlantic slave trade was the same thing. We were taught in school that because when we hear the word African, we believe that they're automatically talking about so-called melanated people, dark-skinned people, right? But we also know that the word Africa does not only denote dark-skinned people. White people can be African. Arabs could be African. Persians could be African. Romans, Ottomans could be African, which are Arabs, right? Ottomans are Arabs, or Arabi. Arab is just a shorter word for rabbi. I'm gonna say again, Arab is just a shorter version of the word rabbi. And we all know that so-called Hebrews or Jewish people own the so-called slave ships that transported the slaves to the Americas. I'm gonna say again, we know by records that a lot of the ships, not all, but a lot of the ships were owned by Jewish people. Jewish people. So the Arab is a short word for rabbi, and the Islamic religion is so damn near similar to the Judaic religion. They're damn near brothers. The father of Islam is Ishmael, and the Bible is Ishmael, which was the first son of Abraham, and Isaac is the second son of Abraham. So the Jewish religion and Islamic religion are technically brothers, half brothers. It's a brotherly religion. It's a brother religion. It's similar, very similar. Comes from the same root family, right? So again, just a short. If you need a longer, detailed explanation, I'm welcome to that. But this is just a shorter synopsis of what I'm trying to say about the Arab slave trade versus the Atlantic slave trade. It's one and the same. They lied to us in school. They lied to us in history books to tell you that there were two separate situations that happened in two separate time periods in history. And that's not the case. So, I'm going to say again, the Atlantic slave trade is equal to the Arab slave trade. It's damn near the same thing. They told you that the Arab slave trade started in the 7th century. The 7th century is really the 1600s. They added so 1492 is really 492 AD. 1492 AD is really 492 AD. 700 AD is really 1700 AD or 1600 AD. Right? Because Anatoly Fomenko, through his 30-year research and his research team of over 20 people, 30 years he researched chronology. And he has proven that timelines, history and timelines were fabricated, and ancient history does not exist. Only only records that we have today is of medieval Renaissance history, medieval Europe, medieval America, not ancient America. I just want to end it on that. Because I feel like a lot of black people, especially black historians, don't really know this shit. You know, we still, black historians still believe the out of Africa theory, which was debunked so many times by so many people. It's crazy. But, you know, the out of Africa theory, all black people came from Africa, was bullshit. People are all over the planet simultaneously. But that's a whole nother story. But I just wanted to make this video about the Arab slave trade and Atlantic slave trade and show you that they were one and the same. And the slave trade was about Caucasians migrating to the Americas, not so-called dark people. Even though dark people came here, but it was mostly Europeans moving and migrating to the Americas. And that was the Arab slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade, and the Piracy Act of 1717. Which tried to regulate the slave trade. It had some success, but it didn't really do anything. So I'm gonna end this video on that. Hopefully you could take what I said, check, research, prove me wrong. Prove me wrong. All right, y'all have a good day.